Tonight, we are going to find out what it actually takes to reach Pluto. Not the simple version. Not the number a textbook gives you and moves on from. The real version, the one that includes why the fastest spacecraft humanity has ever launched could not stop when it got there. Why the physics of getting there fast and the physics of stopping there are in direct opposition. And why, after everything we know, sending a human being to Pluto and back remains one of the most technically demanding problems in the history of exploration. The word "really" in the title is doing work. It is there because the answer is more specific and more uncomfortable than most people expect. Most questions about space travel get answered with numbers that are technically accurate but functionally incomplete. 9.5 years is accurate. It is also incomplete in the way that saying a mountain is 8,000 meters tall is accurate, but does not fully describe what it means to climb it. This script is about what the number means, not just what it is. There is something in the framing of the question that deserves attention before the answer begins. When people ask how long it takes to get to Pluto, they often mean, is it possible? Could we do it? Is it within the range of what human technology can attempt? The answer to that version of the question is yes, with caveats. New Horizons proved it. A 9.5-year mission to the edge of the classical solar system is within the range of what an advanced spacefaring civilization can attempt. But the harder version of the question is, how long would it really take? Meaning, how long until we could actually arrive, stop, stay, and learn something? That version has a different answer. And the difference between the two answers is the actual content of the title. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. On January 19, 2006, NASA launched a spacecraft called New Horizons from Cape Canaveral, Florida. It sat on top of an Atlas V rocket in its most powerful configuration, and it left Earth faster than anything humanity had ever intentionally launched into space. By the time most people on the East Coast had seen the 11 o'clock news, the spacecraft had already passed the orbit of the Moon. Apollo astronauts needed 3 days to cover that same distance. New Horizons covered it in 9 hours. The speed at launch was roughly 58,000 kilometers per hour. For comparison, a commercial jet airliner cruises at around 900 kilometers per hour. New Horizons was moving about 65 times faster than that on the day it left the ground. The Apollo program's Saturn V rocket, which carried astronauts to the Moon and remains one of the most powerful rockets ever flown, could not have sent New Horizons to Pluto in the same time. New Horizons used a different strategy. A smaller, lighter spacecraft with minimal instrumentation on top of a rocket configuration optimized entirely for departure velocity rather than payload capacity. The spacecraft weighed roughly 480 kilograms at launch. Every unnecessary kilogram would have cost years of transit time, and the design reflected that constraint in everything from the size of its scientific instruments to the configuration of its power supply. It was, by any measure, the fastest departure from Earth ever achieved, and the mission it was built for was simple in its premise and extraordinary in its difficulty. Travel to Pluto, the dwarf planet at the far edge of the classical solar system, and take the first close-up photographs of a world no spacecraft had ever seen. The transit took 9 years, 5 months, and 25 days. On July 14, 2015, New Horizons entered the Pluto system traveling at approximately 50,000 kilometers per hour. It made its closest approach at a distance of roughly 12,500 kilometers from Pluto's surface. Its cameras were running. Its instruments were collecting. The data was being stored for later transmission to Earth. At that velocity, the spacecraft crossed the entire Pluto system in under 14 hours. The closest approach window itself lasted approximately 9 minutes. 9 years of travel, 9 minutes of closest approach. The team at Johns Hopkins had spent years designing those 9 minutes. Every instrument had a specific observational window. Every slew of the spacecraft to point cameras or spectrometers at different targets was planned to the second. There was no margin for improvisation. The spacecraft could not be commanded in real time during the flyby because the communication lag meant Earth was receiving telemetry from 4.5 hours earlier. During closest approach itself, the spacecraft was not communicating with Earth at all. It was recording, pointing, measuring, and storing data completely on its own, executing a choreography programmed months before. The scientists on Earth had to wait 13 hours after closest approach before New Horizons turned its antenna toward Earth and confirmed, with a signal that had traveled 4.5 hours to arrive, that the flyby had succeeded. And then Pluto was behind it, growing smaller in the cameras, and New Horizons kept going. It is still going now. As of 2025, the spacecraft is roughly 60 times further from the Sun than Earth is, well past Pluto's current position, heading deeper into the Kuiper belt and eventually toward interstellar space. It will never return. There was never any plan for it to return. This is the moment where most explanations of travel to Pluto stop. 9.5 years, they say, and move on. But that answer assumes that a flyby at 50,000 kilometers per hour is what the title is asking about. It probably is not. The title says, "Get to Pluto," and there is a significant difference between flying past the world in a 14-hour window and actually getting there. New Horizons did not stop at Pluto. It could not stop at Pluto. That distinction is not a footnote. It is the actual answer to the question, and understanding why New Horizons could not stop is the first step toward understanding what it would really take to arrive at Pluto in any meaningful sense. The spacecraft was not poorly designed. The mission was not underfunded for braking. The engineers at Johns Hopkins and NASA were not unaware of the problem. New Horizons flew past Pluto because stopping there with any architecture based on conventional chemical rockets is not something physics currently allows at a reasonable mission scale. The numbers involved in decelerating from that speed are not discouraging, they are physically prohibitive. It helps to sit with the numbers for a moment before moving on to the physics. Pluto right now is approximately 35 astronomical units from the Sun. 1 astronomical unit is the average distance from Earth to the Sun, roughly 150 million kilometers. 35 times that distance puts Pluto at roughly 2 billion kilometers from Earth. Light, traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second, takes approximately 4.5 hours to cover that distance. Every photograph New Horizons took of Pluto during the flyby, every piece of data it collected, was stored on board and then transmitted back at the speed of light. The first images of Pluto in high resolution did not reach Earth until months after the flyby because the transmission rate from that distance is slow and the volume of data was enormous. There were 9 hours and 35 minutes of closest approach science data collected during the July 14, 2015 encounter. The complete dataset took over a year to transmit to Earth in full, 9.5 years to collect the data, a year to send it home. New Horizons was not a failure. It was one of the most successful robotic missions in NASA history. The images it returned transformed scientific understanding of the outer solar system. But it was also a demonstration of exactly what the current ceiling of human space capability looks like when directed at Pluto. The ceiling is defined not by ambition or budget, but by the physics of motion in space, and the ceiling is lower than most people assume. Pluto was discovered in 1930 by a 24-year-old astronomer named Clyde Tomel working at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona. For 85 years after its discovery, humanity's best images of Pluto were blurred spheres from the Hubble Space Telescope, incapable of resolving any surface detail. The first clear picture of Pluto's surface arrived 9.5 years after launch, in the summer of 2015, in a flyby that lasted less than a day. The world sat between discovery and first portrait for 85 years. The portrait itself required nearly a decade of travel, and we have not gone back. It is worth sitting with the 85-year gap for a moment. Most scientific fields produce foundational knowledge about a subject within years or decades of its discovery. The existence of DNA was proposed in the early 1950s and its double helix structure confirmed by 1953. The entire architecture of modern genetics followed in the decades after. Pluto was discovered in 1930, and the first clear image of its surface arrived in 2015. For 85 years, the most important facts about Pluto, its geology, its chemistry, the nature of its moons, the state of its atmosphere, whether it was alive or dead geologically, were completely unknown. They were unknown not because the questions were not asked, but because the distance made them unanswerable by any technology that existed. The 85-year gap is not a failure. It is a measurement of how far away Pluto is, expressed in human time rather than astronomical units. And the gap is not closed. The photograph taken in 2015 was taken in 9 minutes. The archive of knowledge about Pluto produced by New Horizons, comprehensive as it was by comparison to what came before, is a brief first chapter. The actual understanding of Pluto requires residence, not a single fast visit. All of that is relevant to understanding what the title is really asking. And that is where the real answer to the title begins. To understand why New Horizons could not stop, you need to understand one rule that governs every rocket ever built, every spacecraft ever launched, and every mission ever flown to any destination in the solar system. The rule has a name. It is called the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation. And once you understand what it says, the difficulty of reaching Pluto stops being a budget problem or an engineering problem. It becomes a physics problem. The idea at the heart of the rocket equation is simple. A rocket moves by throwing mass backward. The exhaust gases from burning fuel shoot out the back at high speed, and the rocket moves forward in reaction. To change your speed in space, you have to burn fuel. Every meter per second you want to gain or lose costs propellant. Now here is where it gets difficult. The propellant you need to carry is itself mass, and that mass has to be accelerated along with the spacecraft. So carrying more propellant to allow more speed changes makes the spacecraft heavier, which means you need even more propellant to move that heavier spacecraft, which makes it heavier still. The relationship is not linear, it compounds. The more velocity change you need, the exponentially greater the fuel mass required to achieve it. Rocket engineers have a term for total velocity change across a mission. They call it delta V. It is measured in meters per second, and it represents the total budget of speed a spacecraft can spend, either gaining it or losing it, given its propellant load and engine efficiency. New Horizons arrived at Pluto moving at roughly 14 kilometers per second. To enter orbit around a world the size of Pluto, you would need to slow down to a fraction of that. Think of it this way. Pluto's gravity is weak, very weak. The speed needed to orbit Pluto is only about 1 kilometer per second, which means New Horizons would have needed to reduce its velocity by more than 90%. The New Horizons engineering team calculated what that would require. To carry enough propellant to decelerate from interplanetary velocity into Pluto orbit using conventional chemical rockets, the spacecraft would have needed to launch with roughly 1,000 times its actual fuel mass. Not more fuel, or fuel by a factor of 1,000. That is not a spacecraft. That is an object that cannot be launched. The rocket equation does not offer a workaround here. It does not offer a discount for good intentions or clever engineering. Every kilogram of braking fuel you add requires more fuel to lift that fuel from Earth's surface and more fuel to push that fuel across 9 years of deep space, and more fuel still to slow down both the spacecraft and all the braking fuel it is carrying. The numbers spiral outward. They never converge on something feasible. The exponential nature of the relationship is what makes it feel almost cruel. If you need to change your velocity by 1 kilometer per second, the fuel mass required is modest. If you need 2 kilometers per second, the fuel mass more than doubles. At 10 kilometers per second of required velocity change, the fuel must represent the overwhelming majority of your launch mass. At 14 kilometers per second, roughly the speed New Horizons would need to shed to enter Pluto orbit from its approach trajectory, the fuel fraction required by chemical rockets exceeds what any plausible spacecraft could physically carry and still have meaningful payload. The hardware you are slowing down becomes negligibly small compared to the fuel mass needed to slow it. Some missions have partially addressed this by accepting a compromise. Rather than slowing down all the way to orbital velocity at a destination, a spacecraft can use a highly elliptical capture orbit, arriving at a velocity just below escape velocity and entering an enormous, looping orbit that gradually shrinks through a combination of engine burns and aerobraking passes. This technique was used successfully at Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, where thick atmospheres made aerobraking viable. At Pluto, the atmosphere at its thickest is still far too tenuous to provide meaningful drag on a spacecraft traveling at interplanetary speeds. A single aerobraking pass through Pluto's nitrogen atmosphere of 14 kilometers per second would provide a velocity reduction measured in fractions of a meter per second. It is not a workable path. The only remaining option with chemical rockets is to simply accept a much slower arrival velocity, approaching Pluto on a long, energy-minimizing trajectory that brings the spacecraft in gently enough that it requires less fuel to capture into orbit. This approach works. It is how a Pluto orbiter might eventually be flown using ion propulsion, which allows gradual deceleration over months. The cost is time. Decades of it. This is why no probe in history has ever entered orbits around any world in the outer solar system without using that world's atmosphere for braking. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Their various moons, including the dramatic capture of the Cassini probe at Saturn in 2004, all relied on either atmospheric drag or the Pluto equivalent of an impossibly massive fuel budget. Pluto's atmosphere is far too thin to use for braking at interplanetary speeds. There is no shortcut. So the answer to why New Horizons could not stop is not that it ran out of fuel. It is that no version of New Horizons built with conventional technology could ever have carried enough fuel to stop. The mission was a fly-by day physical necessity, not by budget constraint. This is the first wall, and it is the most fundamental one. Every other problem in this script sits on top of it. But before moving on, it is worth letting the rocket equation's implications fully land, because the equation is not just relevant to the Pluto problem. It explains why the entire outer solar system is harder to reach than the inner solar system, in a way that feels disproportionate to the distance. The delta V required to escape Earth's surface and reach low orbit is roughly 9.4 kilometers per second. Getting from low Earth orbit to Mars requires an additional 4 to 5 kilometers per second, depending on the trajectory. Getting from Earth to Jupiter's vicinity requires about 8 kilometers per second beyond Earth escape. Getting to Pluto's distance requires roughly 11 to 14 kilometers per second from Earth escape, again, depending on trajectory and whether any gravity assists are used. None of those numbers differ from each other by more than a factor of 2. But the rocket equation's exponential nature means that doubling the required delta V more than squares the required fuel fraction of the launch mass. The farther out you go, the larger the fraction of your spacecraft that must be propellant. At some point, the entire spacecraft becomes propellant with barely a shell of payload around it. New Horizons managed the mission because it accepted the constraint of a flyby. It did not need to slow down. Its entire delta V budget was spent on the launch and the trajectory corrections along the way. The trip to Pluto, in that narrow framing, was solved by 2006. The trip to Pluto in the sense of actually doing anything useful upon arrival has not been solved yet. There is a practical consequence to this, that NASA mission planners deal with every time outer solar system science is discussed. A mission to Pluto that enters orbit and deploys instruments is not simply a larger version of New Horizons with more fuel. It is a mission of a fundamentally different architecture. The mass ratios involved push you past the point where any single rocket currently in operation can launch the full fuel load required. You either break the mission into pieces, accepting an enormously complex assembly and fueling operation in space, or you find a propulsion system that changes the fuel efficiency baseline. The rocket equation does not care about human preferences. It does not care about scientific priorities. It is not a funding problem. It is a mathematical relationship between mass, exhaust velocity, and achievable delta V, and it has been understood since Konstantin Tsiolkovsky derived it in 1903. Everything we know about rocket science has been built inside its constraints, and those constraints are real. There is one tool humanity has developed that partially softens the velocity problem on deep space missions. It does not solve it, but it changes what is possible enough that every major outer solar system mission in history has used it. It is called a gravity assist, and New Horizons used it on the way to Pluto. The basic idea works like this. Imagine a tennis ball rolling toward a moving wall. If the wall is moving toward the ball bounces back faster than it arrived. It borrowed momentum from the wall. The wall lost a tiny, unmeasurably small amount of its own speed, but the ball gained something real. In space, the moving wall is a planet. As a spacecraft flies past a massive body on a carefully calculated trajectory, the planet's gravity curves the spacecraft's path and effectively flings it forward. The spacecraft gains speed. The planet loses an almost infinitesimally tiny amount of orbital speed that, over the age of the solar system, adds up to exactly nothing detectable. The transaction is real, but asymmetric. The spacecraft wins. New Horizons used Jupiter for this maneuver. In February 2007, just over a year after launch, the spacecraft threaded past Jupiter at roughly 1.6 million kilometers and picked up approximately 4 kilometers per second of additional velocity. Without that boost, New Horizons would have taken roughly 13 years to reach Pluto instead of 9.5. The gravity assist shaved more than 3 years off the transit, but there is a cost that the headline number does not show. The gravity assist is not available on demand. It requires a specific planetary alignment, a window in the solar system's orbital geometry that opens infrequently and closes if you miss it. For the Jupiter assist that New Horizons used, the window for that particular trajectory was narrow. The mission had to launch during a specific period in early 2006 or wait years for the next comparable opportunity. More importantly, the gravity assist adds velocity. It makes the spacecraft faster, and a faster arrival at Pluto means a larger velocity at Pluto's doorstep, which makes the stopping problem even worse. Every kilometer per second gained from Jupiter is another kilometer per second that would have to be shed by a braking system. No spacecraft yet built could carry. The gravity assist solves the transit time problem in one direction and deepens the deceleration problem in the other. For a mission whose only goal is a flyby, this is an acceptable trade. For a mission that needs to enter orbit, it is a trap. The gravity assist can reduce transit time from 13 years to 9.5 years, but it arrives at Pluto at a speed that makes any form of orbital capture impossible without a fuel load that cannot be carried. A slower mission that forgoes the gravity assist might arrive in 15 to 18 years on a more energy-efficient trajectory, but would arrive at a lower velocity, making orbital capture theoretically possible with a large enough ion propulsion system. This is the underlying tension in the design of any serious Pluto orbiter mission. Speed and orbital capture are not just different goals, they actively conflict. Every mission planner choosing a Pluto trajectory is choosing where to sit on the spectrum, from very fast and completely unable to stop to very slow and able to enter orbit. It is the best tool in the toolkit, and it is still only a partial answer. The full picture, then, is this. The fastest route to Pluto requires a powerful rocket and a Jupiter gravity assist, and it gets you there in roughly 9.5 years. On that route, you arrive going too fast to stop. The slower route, a low-energy trajectory designed to allow eventual capture into Pluto orbit, would take dramatically longer. Estimates for a slow orbital approach using current technology run from 20 to 30 years or more, depending on the trajectory. With a gravity assist but a much heavier fuel load, some intermediate architecture might reach Pluto in 15 to 20 years, assuming the propulsion technology exists to slow down on arrival. It currently does not, at any practical mission mass. The gravity assist is not a simple boost. It is a precise maneuver that requires months of preparation, exact navigation, and a spacecraft designed to survive the intense radiation environment near a massive planet. New Horizons passed within 2.3 million kilometers of Jupiter in February 2007, using the flyby not just for speed but for an opportunity to test its instruments. Jupiter's magnetosphere extends far beyond the visible planet, and New Horizons spent several weeks collecting magnetospheric data that supplemented the main Pluto mission objectives. The gravity assist was a scientific opportunity as well as a propulsion strategy. The Voyager missions provide the clearest illustration of what gravity assists built into a mission architecture can achieve, and where they run out of power. Voyager 2 launched in August 1977. It used a rare planetary alignment, one that occurs roughly once every 175 years, to chain together gravity assists from Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in sequence. This grand tour trajectory took the spacecraft across the outer solar system in about 12 years, reaching Neptune by 1989. Without the gravity assists, the same mission would have taken over 30 years on a direct trajectory, and the propellant requirements would have been unmanageable. Voyager 2 passed Neptune at roughly 36,000 km per hour relative to the planet. It could not orbit Neptune. It could not stop at Triton, Neptune's intriguing moon with its retrograde orbit and nitrogen geysers. It gathered its science in a flyby window of hours and continued outward into the Kuiper Belt and beyond. Both Voyager spacecraft are now in interstellar space, still transmitting faint signals home, still carrying the kinetic energy imparted to them by the gravity of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune across 4 decades ago. That is the legacy of the gravity assist. It allowed humanity to visit every outer planet in the solar system within 2 decades of the space age beginning. It made the impossible merely impractical, but it could not make any of those outer planet missions into orbital surveys. It could not give scientists the slow, patient residence above a distant world that produces the deepest science. The Cassini mission at Saturn found a workaround. Rather than arriving from interplanetary distance at high speed and flying past, Cassini travelled on a slower trajectory that allowed it to use Saturn's atmosphere for braking on arrival. That maneuver, called a Saturn orbit insertion burn, combined with a carefully designed approach trajectory, allowed Cassini to slow enough to be captured into Saturn orbit. The mission spent 13 years in the Saturn system and produced more scientific understanding of Saturn and its moons than all previous missions combined. No equivalent option exists at Pluto. The atmosphere is too thin to provide meaningful aerobraking at any practical mission mass. Saturn worked because its atmosphere is thick and extends to considerable altitude. Pluto's atmosphere, when it exists at all as a gas rather than surface frost, has surface pressure measured in microbars. It is close to nothing. This is the ceiling that chemical rockets have reached. Everything above this point requires a different kind of engine. Before getting to that engine, it is worth pausing on something that the velocity numbers tend to obscure. Pluto is not just far away. It is far away in a very specific way, one that shapes every aspect of a mission to reach it. The standard unit for measuring distances in the solar system is the astronomical unit, abbreviated AU. 1 AU is the average distance from Earth to the Sun, roughly 150 million kilometers. Earth sits at 1 AU nu. Mars at its closest is about 0.5 AUA. Jupiter is roughly 5 AU away. Jupiter is roughly 5 AU from the Sun. Saturn is about 9.5 AU. Neptune, the outermost major planet, is roughly 30 AU from the Sun. Pluto, at its current position in 2025, is approximately 35 AU Colli from the Sun. It follows an elliptical orbit with a tilt of 17 degrees relative to the main plane of the solar system, swinging from roughly 29 AU at its closest point to the Sun to roughly 49 AU at its furthest. That full orbit takes 248 Earth years. Pluto last reached its closest point to the Sun in 1989, and it will not return there until 2037. The distance from Earth to Pluto right now is approximately 5.2 billion kilometers. That number is almost meaningless by itself. The human mind does not have a useful reference for 5.2 billion kilometers. So consider it this way: if you drove a car from New York to Los Angeles, you would cover roughly 4,500 kilometers. To cover the current Earth to Pluto distance by car at highway speed, the drive would last approximately 6,000 years. That assumes you never stopped for fuel, never slept, never slowed down. Light travels at 300,000 kilometers per second. At that speed, a signal from Earth to Pluto right now takes approximately 4.5 hours to arrive. Round trip, 9 hours. There is no technology in existence that can change that. Radio waves, laser pulses, any signal that obeys the known laws of physics, all travel at the speed of light. The 4.5-hour delay is not a temporary problem waiting for a better antenna. It is a permanent feature of the distance. What these numbers mean in practice is worth dwelling on for a moment. If you were in orbit above Pluto and you looked toward the Sun, you would see something that no human has yet seen. The Sun from 35 astronomical units away. It would be roughly 1900 times dimmer than it appears from Earth. Not a source of warmth. Not even a disk visible to the naked eye without magnification. A brilliant point of light, far brighter than any other star in the sky, but not the commanding presence it is from Earth's surface or from any inner planet. It would be indistinguishable in appearance from a very bright star. You could block it with a fingertip. The sky around it would be dense with stars, because there is no atmosphere at Pluto distance to scatter light. The Milky Way would be a continuous luminous band, The planets of the inner solar system, Earth among them, would be faint points of light near the Sun, indistinguishable from other stars without a telescope. Earth from Pluto is visible in principle but not by appearance alone. It is just another point of pale light in the vicinity of a bright star. The effect of this isolation on any human presence is not merely aesthetic, it is operational. Every mission to Pluto carries this lag built in. Every command sent takes 4.5 hours to arrive. Every response takes 4.5 hours to return. If something goes wrong at Pluto, the earliest Earth can hear about it is 4.5 hours later, and the earliest Earth can respond is 9 hours after the problem began. During the 2015 New Horizons flyby, the spacecraft entered safe mode 10 days before closest approach. An internal processor conflict triggered an automatic shutdown of non-essential functions. The control team had to diagnose the issue, develop a fix, encode the commands, transmit them, wait 4.5 hours for delivery, wait another 4.5 hours for confirmation of execution, and then assess the results. The team worked through it successfully. New Horizons was restored in time for the flyby, but the episode illustrated with complete clarity what it means to operate a spacecraft at Pluto distance. You are not managing a machine. You are managing a conversation with the past. The communication lag is worth sitting with because it changes the practical nature of any Pluto mission in ways that go beyond the technical. Consider the Curiosity rover on Mars. Mars is, on average, roughly 12 to 24 minutes away by light-speed communication. When Curiosity encounters a piece of terrain its autonomous navigation system cannot safely evaluate, it can stop, photograph the obstacle, and wait for commands from Earth. Scientists and engineers review the images, plan a path, and uplink the instructions. The round trip takes somewhere between 25 minutes and 48 minutes. The rover can act cautiously, pause when uncertain, and rely on human decision-making to guide it through difficult terrain. At Pluto, that same exchange takes a minimum of 9 hours. A spacecraft facing a navigation decision at Pluto cannot pause and wait for human guidance. By the time the signal reporting the obstacle reached Earth and the response arrived at Pluto, the spacecraft would have been moving for 9 hours in whatever direction its last programmed command specified. Pluto operations require a level of spacecraft autonomy that goes significantly beyond anything Mars missions have needed. The spacecraft must be trusted to handle unexpected situations independently, because there is no other option. For a human crew, this is even more consequential. Astronauts who developed a medical emergency at Pluto would be communicating with Earth-based doctors through a 9-hour information lag. A diagnosis response received 9 hours after the symptoms were reported would be advising on a patient whose condition had already changed significantly. The crew would be, in every practical sense, practicing medicine without the ability to consult any expertise beyond what they carried with them. These are solvable problems in principle. Autonomous spacecraft systems can be built to handle complex contingencies. Medical training for long-duration crews can be made more comprehensive. Artificial intelligence systems could eventually substitute for some of the real-time medical expertise, but they are not currently solved, and their solutions add mass, complexity, and cost to a mission that is already difficult to afford. The distance to Pluto is not just a number. It is a set of physical constraints that propagate through every aspect of mission design. Understanding how far away Pluto is means understanding that the communication delay is not an inconvenience. It is a redefinition of what it means to operate there. With the distance and velocity problems established, the question becomes, what would a mission to Pluto that actually accomplishes something require? Not a flyby. Not 9 minutes of closest approach data gathered at 50,000 kilometers per hour. A real mission, one that enters orbit, spends years mapping the surface, studies the chemistry of the atmosphere over multiple seasonal cycles, watches the nitrogen frost sublimate as Pluto moves in its orbit, and perhaps one day deploys an instrument package onto the surface of Tombaugh Regio to measure what the glacier is actually doing. Science returns from sustained orbital observation of a body like Pluto would be qualitatively different from flyby science. Pluto has geological processes operating on timescales from decades to millions of years. A spacecraft that spends 2 or 3 years in orbit can observe seasonal changes, track atmospheric variation, and map the entire surface at resolutions New Horizons could not achieve during its brief pass. It can target specific geological features for repeated observation, catching them in different lighting conditions, different atmospheric states, different orbital positions relative to Charon. The difference between a flyby and an orbiter is not more of the same data. It is a different category of scientific understanding. One that enters orbit, one that maps the surface over years, drops instruments through the thin haze atmosphere, perhaps one day deploys a small lander onto the nitrogen glacier in the heart-shaped basin scientists have named Tomball Regio. What does that mission look like, and why does it not currently exist? The leading mission concept that addresses these questions is called Persephone. It is a proposal developed by a team of planetary scientists, and it represents the current best thinking about what a comprehensive Pluto mission would require. It would carry a suite of roughly a dozen science instruments, including radar capable of probing the subsurface for liquid water spectrometers to characterize the chemistry of the surface and thin atmosphere, and high-resolution cameras to map terrain at scales New Horizons could never achieve in its brief pass. To enter orbit around Pluto, Persephone would use electric ion propulsion. Ion engines work fundamentally differently from chemical rockets. A chemical rocket burns fuel and oxidizer in a violent exothermic reaction, producing hot exhaust gases that shoot backward at high velocity. The thrust is enormous but brief. An ion engine, by contrast, uses electrical power to accelerate charged particles, typically xenon ions, out of the spacecraft at extremely high velocities. The xenon is ionized by stripping away electrons and then accelerated through an electric field before being expelled. The thrust is tiny. At full power, an ion engine might produce force equivalent to the weight of a piece of paper resting on your palm, but it can sustain that force for weeks, months, or years, gradually accumulating velocity changes that would require enormous chemical fuel loads to achieve in the same time. The patience required is not a human quality, which is why ion propulsion works best on robotic spacecraft. A machine can burn its engine for 2 years without complaint. The key metric is called specific impulse, abbreviated ISP. It is a measure of how efficiently an engine uses propellant. The best chemical rockets achieve a specific impulse of roughly 450 seconds. Ion engines achieve 3,000 seconds or more. The difference means ion engines can produce far more total velocity change for the same propellant mass. Over a long mission, that efficiency becomes decisive. The Dawn spacecraft provides the clearest demonstration of what ion propulsion makes possible. Dawn launched in 2007 with an ion propulsion system powered by solar panels. It traveled to the asteroid Vesta, entered orbit, spent over a year studying Vesta's surface in detail, then fired its ion engines again, left Vesta's gravity and traveled to the dwarf planet Ceres, where it entered orbit and continued scientific operations until its xenon fuel was exhausted in 2018. It was the first spacecraft ever to orbit 2 separate bodies beyond Earth, a chemical rocket mission to achieve the same goals. Entering orbit around both Vesta and Ceres would have required a fuel mass so large that no existing rocket could have launched it. The ion propulsion system, operating continuously at a thrust measured in millinewtons, accumulated the delta V required over months of continuous burning. The trade was time for efficiency. Dawn accepted a slower trajectory in exchange for the ability to actually stop at its destinations. For a Pluto mission, the same logic applies with greater severity, because the distances and the required velocity changes are so much larger. An ion propulsion system capable of decelerating a spacecraft into Pluto orbit would need to operate for months while the spacecraft was already in the outer solar system, slowing gradually from interplanetary velocity to orbital velocity. The xenon fuel tank required for this maneuver would be substantial. The entire spacecraft architecture becomes dominated by the mass of propellant for the final deceleration burn, even though the thrust at any given moment is tiny, but ion propulsion introduces its own constraint. At Pluto's distance of 35 ASU, the Sun delivers roughly 1/900th of the energy it delivers at Earth. Solar panels that generate 10,000 watts at Earth would generate about 11 watts at Pluto. No solar array of reasonable size can power an ion engine at that distance. Persephone, like New Horizons, would need to be powered by RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, devices that convert the heat of radioactive decay directly into electricity. New Horizons flew with one RTG producing roughly 240 watts at launch. Persephone would need 4 or 5 RTGs to power its ion drive and full science suite. And here is where the infrastructure problem bites. RTGs are fueled by plutonium-238, a specific isotope not useful for weapons, but ideal for heat generation. The United States effectively shut down its domestic production of plutonium-238 in 1988. Production has restarted, but as of 2025, the supply is still being rebuilt. The rate of new production is not yet sufficient to support multiple major deep space missions simultaneously. Building 5 RTGs for a Persephone-class mission is not a technical problem. It is a supply chain and political will problem. The Voyager spacecraft each flew with 3 RTGs producing roughly 420 watts at launch. Cassini flew with 3 RTGs producing roughly 880 watts. New Horizons flew with 1 RTG producing roughly 240 watts, which was the minimum required to operate its instrument suite. As each spacecraft has aged, the RTG power output has declined by roughly 3 to 4 watts per year due to the gradual decay of the plutonium fuel. New Horizons in 2025 produces substantially less power than it did at launch, and mission controllers have responded by operating only a subset of its instruments at any given time. A complex Pluto orbiter with radar, high-resolution cameras, mass spectrometers, magnetometers, and an ion propulsion system would require power budgets far larger than any single RTG can provide. The 4 or 5 RTG requirement for Persephone represents a fundamentally different scale of nuclear power investment compared to anything currently in development. It is achievable. The technology exists. The roadblock is the production rate of plutonium-238, which cannot be accelerated by engineering. It recedes at the pace of nuclear decay rates and production reactor schedules. Even if those RTGs existed and the mission launched today, Persephone arriving at Pluto using ion propulsion for deceleration would take considerably longer than New Horizons. The slow, efficient deceleration burn required to enter orbit rather than fly past takes time. Current estimates for a Pluto orbiter mission on this architecture run from 15 to 20 years of transit. The mission proposed today would reach Pluto sometime in the early 2040s at the earliest. The mission has not been funded. There is no confirmed launch date. There is a concept. There is a science case. There is no mission. The gap between concept and mission is partly about money and partly about something more fundamental. The kind of institutional commitment required to support a 15 to 20-year project from proposal to arrival requires continuity of political will, budget allocation, and scientific priority that is truly difficult to sustain. Consider the timeline. If a Pluto orbiter mission were proposed and approved in 2026, the earliest realistic launch date would be in the early 2030s, assuming the usual development period of roughly 8 to 10 years for a complex deep space mission. With a 15-year transit using ion propulsion, arrival would occur in the late 2040s. The scientists who proposed and designed the mission would be, in many cases, at or near retirement age when their spacecraft arrived at its destination. The engineers who built the spacecraft might be deceased. The political landscape that funded the mission would have cycled through multiple administrations and priorities. Space exploration operates on a timescale that human institutions are not naturally designed for. The people who make the decision to fund a mission are not the same people who see it arrive. The engineers who design the spacecraft cannot reasonably be expected to be available for troubleshooting 20 years later. Missions to the outer solar system require a kind of institutional memory and commitment that is structurally difficult to maintain across decades of changing priorities, budgets, and leadership. NASA's Cassini mission, which spent 13 years studying Saturn after a 7-year transit, required about 26 years from initial proposal to mission end. That was Saturn, the second planet in the outer solar system. Pluto, more than 3 times Saturn's current distance from Earth, would extend that timeline considerably. There is also the matter of what a Pluto orbiter would be designed to find. The scientific motivation for return missions typically intensifies when a flyby reveals something unexpected. New Horizons revealed a world that looked nothing like the pre-mission mental model. Before July 2015, the dominant scientific expectation was a geologically quiet, heavily cratered, ancient surface typical of small outer solar system bodies. What appeared in the images was a geologically young, chemically complex world with active processes, a structured atmosphere, and a geological diversity comparable to worlds many times its size. The science case for a follow-up mission was arguably stronger the day after the flyby than it had ever been before, precisely because the flyby showed how much remained unknown. Those findings make the scientific case for a follow-up mission compelling. But compelling science cases are not the only variable in mission selection. Instrument cost, launch vehicle availability, political support, and competition from other science priorities all factor into decisions that are made by committees and budget offices, not by scientific merit alone. The power constraint adds a logistical layer that no engineering creativity can easily accelerate. Plutonium-238 production in the United States restarted at Oak Ridge National Laboratory around 2013 after a multi-decade gap. The target production rate has been increasing, but it takes time to accumulate the material for multiple RTGs. A Pluto orbiter requiring 4 or 5 RTGs needs a supply of plutonium-238 that, at current production rates, would take years to accumulate even if all other obstacles were cleared. Power is not the largest obstacles were cleared, but is a real one with a physical timeline that cannot be compressed by funding. All of this together explains why the most capable Pluto mission concept currently in scientific discussion has no launch date and no budget. The technical challenges are known. The solutions are identifiable. The institutional, financial, and material prerequisites stack into a timeline that stretches well into the future. A Pluto orbiter may fly. The science case is strong enough that it should, but should fly, and will fly, have historically been different things in deep space exploration. There is a different approach to the travel time problem, one that does not thread the needle between speed and fuel efficiency the way chemical rockets and ion drives must. It cuts through the needle, and it is not a new idea. In 1955, the United States government initiated a secret program called Project Rover, later known as NERVA, which stands for Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application. The goal was to build a rocket engine powered not by combustion, but by nuclear fission. A nuclear reactor at the core of the engine would heat liquid hydrogen to extreme temperatures, and that superheated hydrogen would shoot out through a nozzle at speeds far beyond what any chemical reaction could achieve. The program ran for 20 years. Engineers tested 28 rocket engines in the Nevada desert. Some of those tests ran for extended periods at full thrust. The Phoebus 2A engine, fired in 1968, produced more than 1,000 megawatts of thermal power. For comparison, a large coal power plant generates roughly 600 megawatts of electrical output. The nuclear rocket produced more raw power in its test run than a major power plant, and it funneled that power into rocket thrust. The performance improvement over chemical rockets was substantial. Where the best chemical rocket engines achieve a specific impulse of about 450 seconds, the NERVA engines demonstrated specific impulse above 800 seconds, roughly twice the efficiency. In practical mission terms, twice the efficiency means either having the fuel mass required for a given mission, or doubling the velocity achievable with the same fuel, or some combination of both. For a Pluto mission, nuclear thermal propulsion changes the calculations significantly. A spacecraft using NTP could reach Pluto in somewhere between 5 and 7 years rather than 9.5. More importantly, it could potentially carry enough propellant to actually decelerate on arrival, because the higher efficiency means the fuel mass for braking stays within a feasible launch range. Preliminary studies of NTP-based Pluto orbiters suggest transit times in the range of 8 to 12 years, with actual orbit capture at the destination. Not a flyby. Not a pass-through. A mission that stays. The NERVA program was cancelled in 1972. Not because the engines failed, they worked. The program was cancelled because the political momentum of the Apollo era had dissipated. Budgets contracted, and there was no specific mission target that justified continued investment in nuclear propulsion. The cancellation left behind a body of test data, engine designs, and technical documentation that remained classified or simply unused for decades. Engineers who worked on NERVA quietly argued that the program had been killed at precisely the moment it was becoming truly useful. The last engine series tested, known as PUE and XE Prime, had reached a level of reliability and performance that would have supported a flight demonstration with modest additional development. The gap between ground test and space-qualified hardware was smaller in 1972 than it had ever been. What nuclear thermal propulsion offers that chemical rockets cannot is a fundamental change in the relationship between propellant efficiency and mission capability. The specific impulse improvement from roughly 450 seconds to 900 seconds does not sound dramatic, but its effect on mission architecture is substantial. For a Pluto orbiter mission, doubling the specific impulse means roughly halving the required propellant fraction of the spacecraft's launch mass. That freed mass can go toward additional science instruments, more robust shielding, or a larger xenon fuel load for ion propulsion used in the final deceleration into Pluto orbit. The combination of nuclear thermal propulsion for the fast transit phase and ion propulsion for the final deceleration into orbit represents the most credible path currently identified in mission design literature for a Pluto orbiter with reasonable transit time. The NTP stage gets the spacecraft to the outer solar system in 5 to 7 years. The ion propulsion stage, powered by multiple RTGs, handles the deceleration into a stable capture orbit over a period of months. The two systems complement each other's weaknesses. The physics of this architecture is sound. The engineering challenges are substantial but not fundamentally different from what was being addressed in 1972. The open questions are about materials, thermal management, and the integration of a nuclear reactor with a spacecraft designed to operate for a decade, but none of them represent basic science problems. They are engineering problems, which means they have solutions that competent teams with adequate resources can find. In 2021, NASA and DARPA jointly initiated a program called DOLRECO for Demonstration Rocket for Agile Cislunar Operations, intended to demonstrate a nuclear thermal rocket engine in space. The program was funded and underway as of 2025, targeting a flight demonstration in the late 2020s. If that demonstration succeeds, it will represent the first nuclear rocket engine operated in space since the Soviet Topaz reactors of the 1970s, and the first American nuclear propulsion test in half a century. Whether DOLRECO leads to a Pluto mission depends on decisions that have not yet been made. The technology path exists, the funding and commitment do not yet, but nuclear thermal propulsion is the most credible near-term route to a Pluto mission that does something more than pass through the system at 50,000 kilometers per hour. Nuclear thermal propulsion changes travel time. It does not change the communication delay. It does not change the power problem. It cannot build the RTG supply chain faster than physics allows plutonium to be produced. And it cannot change the fact that even the fastest technically credible architecture produces a mission that for a human crew would last a decade or more. Which brings the script to the question it has been building toward all along. Everything discussed so far has been about robots, machines that can be switched off, powered down, put into hibernation, awakened years later, machines that do not need food, water, air, or psychological stability. Machines that do not age, lose bone mass, or develop radiation-induced cellular damage over a decade of exposure to deep space. A human mission to Pluto is a different problem in kind, not just in degree. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. That altitude is inside Earth's magnetosphere, the vast magnetic shield generated by the planet's molten iron core. The magnetosphere deflects most of the high-energy particles that fill deep space. Astronauts on the ISS receive radiation doses significantly above what they would receive on the ground, but still within managed limits. After 6 months aboard the station, astronauts return to Earth measurably changed. Their bone density has declined. Their cardiovascular systems have adapted to a fluid shift pattern that does not exist on Earth. Some experience vision degradation caused by changes in intracranial pressure. These effects are documented, studied, and partially mitigated through exercise regimes and careful monitoring. Beyond Earth's magnetosphere, the radiation environment changes fundamentally. Deep space is permeated by galactic cosmic rays, high-energy atomic nuclei traveling at significant fractions of the speed of light. They originate from supernova remnants and other extreme astrophysical events outside the solar system. They are among the most energetic particles in the known universe, and they are effectively impossible to stop. A cosmic ray traveling at 99% of light speed carries enough energy to pass through the walls of any spacecraft currently designed through the human body inside it and out the other side, depositing ionizing radiation along the entire path. The total shielding mass required to substantially reduce galactic cosmic ray flux would make a spacecraft too heavy to launch. The numbers are discouraging. To reduce the dose from GCRs within NASA's current career limits for a decade-long mission would require a shielding mass of many hundreds of tons, depending on material choices. The most capable rocket currently in service, the SpaceX Starship in its fully developed configuration, can lift roughly 100 tons to low Earth orbit. Assembling a shielded human habitat in space from multiple launches is theoretically possible, but would require a scale of orbital assembly operations that exceeds anything currently planned. Engineers have explored wall-to-walls, polyethylene panels, and various composite materials. None produce an acceptable balance between mass and protection. There is no current solution that allows a crew to travel for a decade in deep space and emerge without significantly elevated radiation exposure. NASA's current career dose limits for low Earth orbit astronauts would be exceeded during the transit to Pluto, before the crew reach their destination. The galactic cosmic ray problem is worth being specific about, because the general term radiation can obscure the particular nature of what deep space environments do. Solar radiation, including the energetic particles released during solar flares and coronal mass ejections, is a serious hazard for astronauts beyond Earth's magnetosphere. But solar radiation is partially manageable. It is variable, with periods of high activity and quiet periods. Solar particle events can be predicted with some lead time. Shielding against solar particles, while heavy and expensive, is physically achievable at mass levels that could plausibly be launched. Galactic cosmic rays are fundamentally different. They originate outside the solar system, from supernova remnants and other extreme astrophysical events. They travel at very close to the speed of light. A single ion nucleus traveling at 99% of light speed carries enough kinetic energy to be literally visible as a streak of light in the dark adapted eye of an astronaut, a phenomenon reported by Apollo moonwalkers who saw flashes when their eyes were closed. Those light flashes are individual cosmic ray particles passing through the eyeball and interacting with the retina. Most cosmic ray particles do not produce visible flashes, but do deposit ionizing radiation along their path through tissue. Over years, this accumulation of DNA damage in cells that divide slowly or not at all raises the risk of cancer, potentially damages the nervous system, and may impair cognitive function through mechanisms still being studied. There is no known material that blocks high-energy cosmic rays without producing secondary radiation of its own. The only effective mitigation is reducing transit time. Beyond radiation, the body continues its adaptations. Bone density loss proceeds at roughly 1% per month in microgravity, without continuous resistance exercise, and exercise alone does not fully prevent it over a multi-year mission. Muscle atrophy requires constant management. The immune system shows changes in cellular composition during extended spaceflight that researchers are still characterizing. The cardiovascular system remodels itself in ways that can create problems upon return to gravity. For a crewed Pluto mission using NTP with each transit leg taking roughly 5 to 6 years, the total mission duration would be somewhere around 12 to 15 years from departure to return. That is 12 to 15 years of continuous exposure to galactic cosmic rays, muscle and bone deconditioning, immune system alteration, and the psychological weight of isolation at the most remote human outpost ever attempted. The ISS research program has produced significant data on human adaptation to space, but it has a hard boundary on what it can tell us. Every ISS mission ends. The astronaut returns to Earth and begins recovery. The longest ever continuous spaceflight, about 437 days aboard Mir by cosmonaut Valery Polyakov, showed that extended duration was possible with sustained countermeasures. But Polyakov was in orbit within Earth's magnetosphere for the entire time, shielded from the worst of the deep space radiation environment. He returned to Earth physically diminished but functionally intact. The unique danger of a Pluto mission is not any single effect, but the compound interaction of all of them over a time frame long enough that current research gives no confident baseline. After 12 years, what does bone density look like in a crew that has done everything medically possible to preserve it? After 12 years of cumulative galactic cosmic ray exposure, what does the central nervous system show? After 12 years of 9-hour communication lag, what does crew psychology look like? These are questions that cannot currently be answered by extrapolating from the existing database of spaceflight experience. The missions that would generate that data would themselves be Pluto-class missions. There is also a selection problem. The crew for a Pluto mission would need to depart knowing they would not return for 12 to 15 years. They would leave Earth when their children were young and return to adults. They would age visibly while the people they knew at home aged in parallel but separately. This is not inherently impossible, but it represents a form of sacrifice that no space mission history has required at that scale, and it will influence who is willing to go what psychological profiles are suitable, and how mission selection must be approached differently from any prior crewed mission. The communication delay matters here in a way that goes beyond operations. At Pluto, the crew would receive messages from Earth 9 hours after they were sent. A birthday greeting sent from a family member arrives 9 hours old. News from Earth is 9 hours stale. A medical consultation question gets its answer 9 hours later. For most of the mission, the psychological experience would be one of profound temporal isolation, not just physical distance. Separation in time as well. Psychological research on isolated groups, Antarctic winter over teams, submarine crews, and simulation studies for long Mars missions all indicate that communication latency above roughly 20 minutes begins to create operational and psychological stress that requires deliberate management. Pluto's communication lag is 13 times beyond that threshold, sustained for over a decade. The Antarctic winter over analogy is instructive but limited. Researchers who spend winter at remote Antarctic stations, unable to leave or receive visitors for months, experience measurable psychological changes including increased interpersonal conflict, reduced motivation, cognitive changes, and a complex emotional state, sometimes called the winter over syndrome. These effects have been documented across dozens of Antarctic expeditions and have informed the design of crew selection and support programs for space missions. They return to the outside world in the spring. The most severe symptoms resolve with return to normal social contact. The isolation is bounded and known to be temporary, and that knowledge is itself a significant psychological resource. The most extreme human isolation studies have lasted less than 2 years. A Pluto mission crew would need to sustain functional group dynamics, professional performance, and psychological health for a duration that no research program has approached. There is also a motivation question that is easy to overlook. The Antarctic researchers know they will return. They know their isolation has a defined end. A Pluto crew would know their return date in principle, but the uncertainty inherent in a decade-long deep space mission, any of dozens of technical failures that mission design cannot fully anticipate, would create a form of psychological pressure that is qualitatively different from knowing you will be home in 6 months. Mission designers working on long-duration spaceflight psychology have identified this uncertainty as one of the most significant factors in crew psychological health, more difficult to manage than the isolation itself. There's a human mission to Pluto in the domain of the theoretically possible, but the gap between theoretically possible and practically achievable is filled, at every point, with problems that humanity does not yet know how to solve. The bone density problem alone illustrates how the timescale changes the nature of the challenge. Current ISS protocols require astronauts to exercise roughly 2 hours per day to partially offset bone and muscle loss. After 6 months aboard the station, the best-maintained crew members still return with measurable bone density reduction and require weeks to months of rehabilitation. For a 10-year Pluto mission, the cumulative effect of even partially mitigated deconditioning is not well characterized by research because no human has ever experienced it. The longest continuous human spaceflight was approximately 14 months aboard the Soviet Mir space station. A Pluto mission would extend that record by a factor of 8. The radiation problem is arguably harder. Bone and muscle respond to exercise. Galactic cosmic ray exposure does not respond to anything currently available. The particles travel at too close to light speed, and carry too much energy to be deflected by the magnetic fields that can handle lower energy solar particles. Adding passive shielding in the form of water wools, polyethylene, or aluminum helps with some radiation types but has limited effect on the highest energy GCRs. To provide meaningful protection against galactic cosmic rays during a 10-year transit, the shielding mass required would be so large that no currently planned launch vehicle could lift it. This is not a problem that engineering can simply solve by making something bigger. It is a constraint imposed by the relationship between cosmic ray energy and matter. Very high-energy particles interact with shielding material in ways that can produce secondary radiation. So simply adding more shielding can actually increase the radiation dose in some scenarios. The solution, if it exists, requires material science advances, biological research into radiation countermeasures, or propulsion advances that reduce transit time enough that total dosage stays within manageable limits. Psychological isolation at Pluto distance is also not a simply managed variable. Research on isolated groups including Antarctic winter crews, submarine personnel, and astronaut psychological studies consistently identifies communication latency as a significant stressor beyond about 20 minutes. Teams operating with that kind of lag develop adaptation strategies, but also show elevated rates of intercrew conflict, reduced morale, and increased cognitive isolation. A crew at Pluto would not be experiencing any form of real-time human contact for the entire duration of the mission. Every conversation with family or friends would arrive as a recorded message and be answered with another recorded message, separated by 9 or more hours each way. Over a decade, the psychological weight of that isolation is unknown, because it has never been studied in anything resembling the relevant time frame. The cumulative picture is that a human Pluto mission is not simply difficult. It is difficult in multiple independent dimensions simultaneously, and the solutions in each dimension interact in ways that make the overall problem harder than the sum of its parts. Radiation shielding adds mass, which requires more propellant, which affects transit time, which affects total radiation dose. Biology countermeasures require consumable supplies which add mass, which again propagates through the propellant equations. There is no clean decomposition where you solve one problem and then move to the next. Every solution costs something that feeds back into the other constraints. There is a human mission to Pluto in the domain of the theoretically possible. It requires breakthroughs in several fields that are actively being worked on. It requires institutional commitments of a kind that no space agency has yet demonstrated at this scale and duration. It requires accepting risks that are, by any reasonable standard, substantially greater than those of any human mission previously attempted. None of that makes it impossible. But it is honest to say that the gap between current capability and what a human Pluto mission requires is not a gap measured in years. It is a gap measured in generations of scientific and engineering progress. Before returning to the honest answer the title deserves, it is worth pausing at Pluto itself, because after everything it costs to get there, the world waiting at the end of this transit is not the featureless ice rock it was assumed to be for most of the 20th century. When New Horizons' images reached Earth in the weeks following the July 2015 flyby, they showed something nobody had confidently expected. Pluto was not a geologically dead frozen stone drifting at the edge of the solar system. The expectation, reasonable given what was known before, was a heavily cratered, ancient surface. Small bodies in the outer solar system tend to be passive records of their formation and early bombardment history, their surfaces accumulating craters over billions of years with little to erase them. Pluto, small and cold and far from the sun, was expected to look like that. Old, scarred, uncomplicated. Instead, New Horizons found a world that looked like it had been recently active. It was a world with mountain ranges, water ice mountains, rising 300 meters or 500 meters above the surrounding plains, young enough by geological standards that they could not have been formed by any process that does not continue today. It was a world with a vast frozen basin, roughly the size of Texas and Oklahoma combined, named Tombaugh Regio in honor of Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer who discovered Pluto in 1930. The basin's surface is so smooth and so free of impact craters that scientists estimate it has been resurfaced within the last 10 million years. On the geological timescale, that is effectively yesterday. It was a world with a thin but structured atmosphere. Nitrogen, methane, and carbon monoxide gases create a faint haze extending roughly 200 kilometers above the surface, casting blue tints into the atmospheric layers visible in New Horizons' backlit images. That atmosphere freezes and falls to the surface as frost as Pluto moves further from the Sun on its long elliptical orbit, then sublimes back into gas as Pluto approaches perihelion. The atmosphere breathes with the orbit. Pluto has 5 known moons. The largest, Charon, is so large relative to Pluto that the two objects orbit a shared center of gravity that lies above Pluto's own surface in the space between them. The system is technically a binary dwarf planet, not a planet with a moon, because neither object orbits around the other's center. They orbit a point between them. They are tidally locked to each other, each always showing the same face to its companion. From Pluto's surface, Charon does not rise or set. It hangs in the same position in the sky permanently, going through phases like the moon does from Earth, but never moving across the sky, never rising above the horizon on one side and setting on the other. It is simply there, always, a fixed companion in the same direction. The 4 smaller moons, Styx, Nix, Kerberos, and Hydra, are much smaller and orbit further out. New Horizons photographed all of them. Hydra was found to be elongated, suggesting it formed from the collision event that created the entire Proto-Charon system billions of years ago. The system as a whole has the character of a formation record, each moon a fragment of the ancient impact preserved in orbit. From Pluto's surface, Charon would hang motionless in the sky, 4 times larger in apparent diameter than the full moon appears from Earth. The surface temperature averages approximately -230 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, nitrogen ice is under pressure from its own overlying mass and behaves like a slow, viscous plastic over geological timescales. It flows, not quickly, not in any time frame a human observer could watch, but over centuries and millennia, the nitrogen glacier moves, filling in impact craters, building pressure ridges, transporting material across the surface in a process that may explain the almost artificial smoothness of Tomball Regio. The basin looks like it was resurfaced recently because, in geological terms, it was. Nitrogen glaciation is actively erasing Pluto's oldest surface record in that region, leaving a clean, nearly crater-free plain that records only the most recent history. Beneath the ice, models suggest there may be a subsurface ocean of liquid water maintained by radiogenic heat from the decay of heavy elements in Pluto's core. Not confirmed, but not ruled out. What exists at Pluto is not fully known in many of its most important details. New Horizons gave science its first portrait of this world, and that portrait immediately revealed how much remained to be understood. Scientists identified geological processes whose mechanisms are still debated. They found organic molecules in concentrations that raised questions about chemistry in extreme environments. They mapped the diversity of terrain across a world smaller than Earth's moon and found more variation than expected. The case for returning is not about nationalism or flag planting. It is not about records or prestige. It is about the fact that one fast flyby of a geologically active, chemically complex world, with a possible subsurface ocean and the solar system's most unusual binary dwarf planet configuration, barely qualifies as an introduction. Science does not end with a first look. It begins there. The mountains, for example, have not been explained. Water ice at -230 degrees Celsius is rigid enough to form structures of the kind New Horizons photographed. On Earth, mountains are built by tectonic forces, the movement of crustal plates driven by internal heat. Pluto is too small for plate tectonics in the conventional sense, and the energy source that maintains geological activity at those temperatures remains a subject of active research. The leading candidates involve radiogenic heat from the decay of heavy elements in Pluto's core, tidal forces from the Charon orbital interaction, and possibly cryovolcanism, a process where material from a subsurface liquid reservoir erupts onto the surface. New Horizons provided evidence consistent with multiple explanations. It did not have enough time to resolve which one is correct. The smooth basin of Tomball Regio is similarly puzzling. Surfaces that have been exposed for billions of years in the outer solar system accumulate impact craters. The longer a surface has been untouched, the more craters it acquires. Tomball Regio has almost none. Its surface appears geologically fresh, actively reshaped by nitrogen glaciation in a cycle driven by Pluto's long, elliptical orbit. But the mechanism operating at these temperatures, the details of how nitrogen ice flows and redistributes itself on a timescale relevant to observation, is not fully understood. The organic chemistry is perhaps the most scientifically charged of the questions New Horizons opened. Pluto's surface contains complex organic compounds, specifically tholins, reddish-brown materials produced when ultraviolet radiation acts on nitrogen and methane. The term tholins was coined by Carl Sagan and Bishun Kari in 1979 to describe the sticky brown residue that forms when simple organic molecules in a gas mixture are irradiated. The name comes from the Greek word for muddy, which reasonably describes their appearance. Tholins are not life, but they represent the kind of prebiotic organic chemistry that is thought to have played a role in the origin of life on early Earth, when similar UV-irradiated organic mixtures were common in the atmosphere and on the surface. Finding tholins at Pluto does not imply biology. It implies that the chemistry of life's building blocks reaches further into the outer solar system than some models had predicted. Tholins are significant not because they indicate life, but because they represent exactly the kind of prebiotic chemistry that scientists believe was common in the early solar system. Studying them in detail at Pluto requires spectroscopic analysis at scales and sensitivities that a flyby spacecraft collecting data during a 9-minute window simply cannot provide. And then there is the subsurface. Theoretical models suggest that the combination of radiogenic heating, tidal interaction with Charon, and the insulating properties of Pluto's ice shell could maintain a liquid water ocean beneath the surface, possibly at depths of 100 to 200 kilometers. If it exists, this ocean would make Pluto a member of a growing list of outer solar system bodies with subsurface liquid water, joining Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, Titan, and Enceladus. A subsurface ocean at Pluto distance, in an environment with complex organic chemistry on the surface above, raises questions that current instruments and current mission designs cannot yet answer. None of this makes Pluto a likely home for life. The temperatures, distances from energy sources, and chemical environment make the probability very low by any current framework for assessing habitability. But the questions it raises about the origins of complex chemistry in the outer solar system, about the distribution of liquid water in environments once thought too cold to sustain it, and about the range of geological activity that can persist over billions of years in small cold worlds are open. They require a mission that can stay, standing on Pluto's surface, which no human being has ever done, and which no current mission plan proposes. You would experience a world both alien and deeply physical. Gravity 1/17 of Earth's. Every step a slow arc, quieter than the moon because there is no crunch of regolith. Only the compression of nitrogen frost. A person weighing 80 kilograms on Earth would weigh roughly 7 kilograms on Pluto. The sensation would be closer to controlled floating than walking. The sun visible in the sky, unmistakably brighter than every other star but casting almost no warmth. A horizon close enough to feel intimate by planetary standards because Pluto is small. And above, Charon, motionless, enormous, locked in its permanent aspect. The universe offers relatively few places that look like this. Pluto is one of them, and we have spent exactly 9 minutes at its closest. The title asks how long it would really take. The honest answer is not a single number, it is a range, and what it covers depends on what getting to Pluto means to you. If it means a flyby at maximum speed with current technology, the answer is approximately 9.5 years. That is what New Horizons achieved. New Horizons launched during an optimal window for a Jupiter gravity assist, used the most powerful rocket configuration available at the time, and carried a minimal payload to keep mass low. No chemical rocket mission with any realistic architecture can do meaningfully better without similar conditions. A less optimal launch window or a heavier payload pushes that number up, not down. If you mean getting a spacecraft to Pluto that does something more than pass through, the number changes significantly. A spacecraft that enters orbit and conducts years of science requires either a very long, low-energy transfer trajectory or a propulsion system more efficient than chemical rockets. Using current ion propulsion technology, the transit would take roughly 15 to 20 years. Using nuclear thermal propulsion, that range compresses to approximately 8 to 12 years, depending on mission architecture. In either case, the spacecraft would arrive and stay, not fly past. The science return would be incomparably greater than New Horizons. But the mission does not exist yet. If it means a human crew, the numbers shift into territory that is harder to describe with confidence because they depend on solutions that have not been found. A human Pluto mission using nuclear thermal propulsion with each leg of the transit taking 5 to 6 years would involve a round-trip mission of somewhere between 12 and 20 years, depending on how long the crew spent in the Pluto system before returning. Current understanding of biology in that environment suggests the crew would exceed lifetime radiation dose limits well before arrival. The psychological isolation would have no precedent in the history of human exploration. The medical autonomy required, given communication delays that make real-time consultation with Earth impossible, would demand levels of onboard expertise and decision-making capability that go well beyond what any current crew selection or training program provides. None of that is the same as impossible. It is the same as not yet solved. The comparison that puts these timescales in perspective is not speed. It is the pace of human technological progress. The analogy to aviation history is useful but imperfect. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk for 12 seconds, covering about 37 meters. The total horizontal distance of that flight was shorter than the wingspan of a modern commercial airliner. 66 years later, in 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the Moon. From first powered flight to lunar landing in 66 years. In the 56 years since Apollo 11, humanity has not returned to the Moon with a crewed landing, though the Artemis program is working toward that goal and has made measurable progress. But the pace of outer solar system exploration specifically has been slower than the pace of early spaceflight would have suggested. We have visited every planet in the solar system with at least a flyby. We have entered orbit around Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. We have landed on Mars, Venus, Titan, the Moon, several asteroids, and Comet 67P. But the outer solar system beyond Saturn, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, has been visited by flyby missions only, with no orbiters and no landers. The gap between capability and commitment, between what engineering could theoretically achieve and what missions have actually been approved and funded, is substantial. The pace of space exploration has not followed a simple exponential curve. It follows the curves of funding, political will, and technological bottleneck, each of which has its own timeline. The history of Pluto itself reflects this. Clyde Tombaugh discovered Pluto in 1930. The first serious scientific interest in a mission to Pluto emerged in the 1970s among a group of planetary scientists who called themselves, somewhat informally, the Pluto Underground. Proposals were put forward through the 1980s and 1990s, some of which were selected and then cancelled. New Horizons was finally approved in 2001 and launched in 2001. The gap between first scientific proposal and successful launch was roughly 3 decades. The gap between discovery and first photograph of the surface was 85 years. These are not numbers that suggest the path to Pluto is blocked. They suggest that it is long, and that length has nothing to do with the physical distance. It has to do with the intersection of available technology, institutional commitment, scientific priority, and the willingness to invest in missions that will not return results within a single political cycle. Somewhere in the outer solar system, at roughly 35 AU from the Sun, a world is completing another fraction of its 248-year orbit. Its nitrogen glaciers are slowly flowing across the surface of its frozen heart-shaped plain. Its haze atmosphere is thinning as the orbit carries it further from the Sun's warmth. Its mountains of water ice are standing exactly as they were when New Horizons photographed them in 2015, because nothing moves quickly at these temperatures and pressures, and nobody is there to see it. No spacecraft is in orbit above it. No probe has landed on its surface. No instrument is measuring the chemistry of its thin atmosphere or the seismic signatures of whatever geological process continues to reshape its terrain. The world at 35 AU is exactly as unknown today as it was on the morning of July 15, 2015, the day after the flyby, when the closest approach was over and New Horizons was already receding. That is what really means in the title. It is worth being specific about what the word really is pointing at, because titles like this one can promise the uncomfortable version and deliver only the mild version. The mild version is, it takes 9.5 years. The uncomfortable version is what this script has built toward. It takes 9.5 years to get close enough for 9 minutes of good science, and there is currently no pathway funded or in development to do more than that on any near-term horizon. The Voyager probes are often held up as evidence that the outer solar system is not beyond reach. Launched in 1977, still transmitting nearly half a century later, but Voyager's scientific legacy came from the brief encounter windows at each planet. Voyager 2's encounter with Uranus in January 1986 was the closest approach of any spacecraft to that planet in history, and it lasted a few days. Uranus has not been revisited since. A complete, detailed understanding of Uranus, its moons, its magnetic field, its interior, remains a scientific gap that is widely acknowledged but unfilled because the mission required to fill it does not currently exist. Pluto is in the same category but farther and more recently encountered, which means the gap between what we know and what we would need to know is even wider. The close-up portrait New Horizons provided has been transformative for planetary science. It has also made clear, precisely because it was so revealing, how much was left undone in those 9 minutes. The planets and moons of the inner solar system have been visited, revisited, orbited, landed upon, and in some cases driven across by wheeled robots. Mars has been studied by orbiters, landers, and rovers for decades. Venus has been reached by atmospheric probes. The Moon has been walked on by 12 human beings and sampled by robotic landers from multiple nations. Even the asteroid belt has been visited by multiple missions. But the outer solar system, everything from Jupiter's orbit outward, has been touched by a handful of missions, most of them flybys. The outer solar system is not the edge of the observable universe. It is just the edge of what humanity has seriously explored so far. Pluto is the farthest endpoint of that partially explored territory. It sits at the boundary between the planetary solar system we've investigated with some depth and the vast outer regions we have barely touched. Getting there in the truest sense, entering orbit, conducting long-duration science, one-day landing, requires a commitment that has not yet been made. The distance is real. The difficulty is documented. The universe, as has been noted before in many different contexts by many different people who looked outward from this planet, does not offer what you have not yet been willing to work for. There is a larger answer embedded in all the specific answers, and it is the one the title is actually pointing toward. Pluto sits at approximately 35 AU from the Sun right now. For the 8 major planets, the farthest is Neptune at roughly 30 AU. Everything inside that boundary is, in principle, reachable by a robotic spacecraft in a human lifetime with technology that either exists or could be built within the next generation. Missions to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and their moon systems are long but feasible. We have flown them, or we have the engineering knowledge to fly them. Pluto is at the edge of that accessible zone and barely over it. It is the first destination in the solar system where the travel time in a single human lifetime becomes uncertain enough to resist a simple answer, where the technology required to do more than a flyby does not yet exist, and where the physics of getting there begins to impose costs that civilization-scale commitments of time and resources would be required to overcome. Beyond Pluto is the Kuiper Belt, a vast ring of icy bodies extending from roughly 30 AS/UNU to 50 AS/UNU. Beyond that, the scattered disk and eventually the Oort cloud, a theoretical sphere of cometary bodies extending perhaps 100,000 AU from the Sun. The nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, is roughly 2 light-years away, which is approximately 265,000 AU. On that scale, Pluto is not the far edge of the solar system. It is just past the beginning of the middle. The question of how long it takes to reach Pluto is really a question about where humanity currently stands in its relationship to the solar system. The answer is close enough to have sent one spacecraft past it once in a 9-year flyby that could not stop, and not yet capable of doing much more than that. New Horizons is still out there, moving at roughly 14 kilometers per second relative to the Sun, heading deeper into the Kuiper Belt and eventually toward the heliopause, the boundary where the Sun's solar wind yields to the wider interstellar medium. It carries no crew. It sends back data on the heliospheric environment using instrumentation that was designed in the 1990s. It does not know it was ever launched from Earth, or that any world was ever watching as it arrived at Pluto. The spacecraft was put into hibernation mode periodically during the long coast to Pluto to reduce wear on its systems and conserve power. During those hibernation periods, it was effectively a metal box drifting through empty space with most of its systems powered down. Mission controllers on Earth could not see its condition clearly, could not receive real-time health data, and could only verify it was still operational when it was awakened and responded to uplink commands. For months at a time, New Horizons was out of meaningful contact with Earth not because of distance, but because of hibernation, and the control team trusted the physics of the trajectory and the engineering of the spacecraft to keep it alive through those long silences. That trust was warranted. New Horizons was awakened precisely as planned each time and continued on its path. The 2015 anomaly, the safe mode event, 10 days before closest approach, was the moment when the margin nearly ran out. It did not. The mission succeeded. It will pass through the heliopause and enter interstellar space, following Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 out beyond the Sun's influence. It will continue moving for billions of years. The spacecraft does not require anything from us to continue. It already has everything the physics of inertia provides. But it carries something in its trajectory and its history that matters beyond the mission's science. It carries the fact that a civilization on a small planet in the inner solar system 9.5 years from Pluto, at maximum effort, pointed its best technology at the farthest edge of its accessible neighborhood, and for 9 extraordinary minutes saw a world it had never seen. The surface details in those images were not expected. The young terrain, the mountains, the smooth glacier, the haze, the color, the complexity of the moons, none of it matched what a dead frozen rock at the edge of the solar system was supposed to look like. Pluto turned out to be a world with active geology and chemical complexity, in an environment where neither should have been. That surprise is, in its own way, the best argument for going back. The universe does not reward the assumption that distant things are simple. That is what the answer to the title actually is. Not 9.5 years, not 15 years, not the number. The answer is that Pluto is exactly far enough away to show us where we currently stand. We can reach it at maximum effort in under a decade and see it for a few hours. We cannot yet stop there, stay, study it, or send a crew. The gap between those two statements is the real answer. It is measured not in kilometers, but in the physics problems that remain unsolved, the propulsion technology not yet demonstrated, the biology countermeasures not yet developed, and the institutional commitment not yet made. The universe does not negotiate on distance. It does not reduce the radiation in deference to human biology. It does not slow down the solar wind for easier shielding. It does not shorten the signal delay because researchers are impatient. The constraints are what they are, and Pluto sits precisely where it sits, somewhere out there, visible tonight through a good telescope as a point of pale light in the constellation Sagittarius. A world smaller than Earth's moon continues its long orbit. It has been there for 4-5 billion years. It will be there long after this night. The distance is real. The difficulty is honest. And the universe, as always, has offered no exceptions. There is a kind of honesty in that. The universe does not hide its constraints. It does not pretend that 35 astronomical units is easy because someone wants it to be. It does not lower the radiation environment as a courtesy to human biology. The constraints are stated clearly in the physics, and they have been understood for decades. The honest answer to the title question requires understanding all of them together, not just the most comfortable one. There is a kind of honesty in that. The universe does not hide the difficulty. Every piece of information about what it takes to reach Pluto is knowable from Earth. The orbital mechanics, the rocket equation, the radiation environment, the communication lag, the power constraints, the biology. None of this is hidden. The answers are in the data, in the papers, in the engineering analysis that the New Horizons team and the planetary science community have produced. The difficulty of getting to Pluto is completely transparent. The only question is what humanity does with that information. 9.5 years to fly past, 15 to 20 years to orbit. A decade of human mission time using technology that does not yet exist. The real answer is that it costs that and more, much more, to do anything else than blimps. And the world 35 AU, with its active geology and its organic chemistry and its possible subsurface ocean and its unanswered questions, is worth doing more for. The universe put something interesting at the edge of our neighborhood. It did not make getting there easy. Those two facts belong together. The distance to Pluto measured in years of travel, in communication delays measured in hours, in fuel-mass ratios that break the feasibility of stopping, in biology problems that decades of spaceflight research have not solved, is the honest current answer to the title. Not a number alone, a description of where the physics pushes back and how much further the engineering needs to go before getting to Pluto means something more than what New Horizons managed in 9 extraordinary years and 9 extraordinary minutes. Good night.